Thanks very much for having me here. This is a pleasure. I can relate personally to many of the comments that I've heard during the talks, but also last night. So I've spent 3 years full-time here, and like Virgilio, those were the most productive 3 years of my career by far. So that's one thing. Another thing is I've visited over the years, and I was trying to think for me personally what kind of sets this place apart. And it's been very good to me. One aspect is, I didn't necessarily come with training from Minnesota or Minnesota East or Far East or even no training, Alan says. So zero training according to Alan. So one thing is just like very open to people from all over the country, all over the world. If you're excited about things. I remember Ed was excited about what I was working on, even if I didn't necessarily use the right or the best tools or the best methods. So that openness, I think, is a huge strength, and it's benefited me. Another thing is I come from a really big Irish Catholic family, and we just argue about everything, and there's a lot of ridicule, but at the same time, there's like affection and respect, mostly, underlying it there. So I came here, and I said, this is like home. And then the third thing is that I really noticed here is that people take economics really, really seriously. But at the same time, they don't take themselves personally entirely seriously. And so I think it makes it fun. I remember saying to Patrick one time, this comment, and he said, oh, totally. When we have people come in to hire permanently or to visit, we make sure they're good and fun. And then he hardly pauses before saying, except for you. Okay, so thank you for having me here. This is joint work with a bunch of people, and it kind of reflects their agenda more than mine in a way, because my agenda is typically other people have theories, and I try to get new microdata to try to shed light on those theories. So first of all, this is different because theory is in the title. So it's like a reverse engineering exercise. We're going to take other people's facts, take them at face value, assume they're right, and then say, let's try to construct a theory that might contribute to, account for, explain some of those facts. So it's heavily influenced by my co-authors in this respect. So the broad macro facts that we're trying to construct a simple theory to account for are, I'll say them briefly and then elaborate on them, that the growth has been low lately, labor share's fallen, and concentration is up. Again, this isn't really our contribution. Other people have documented this, so I'll go over this really quickly. Our story, to just give you the idea right up front, it's got to be heterogeneous firms or else we can't explain concentration. And we're going to have a driving force. Remember, one thing I very much learned from Minnesota is be very clear about your data generating mechanism if you're going to do empirical work. What are the driving forces? What's generating identification? So our story, it's really a story, is the IT shock may be an important shock. And so we're going to feed through our model one shock. And that's going to be something that you'll see what it is in the model when I describe the model, but the story we're giving it is maybe communication costs have made it easier for big companies to manage more products or more locations. So if you want to think of 3 examples, I'll give you Amazon having so many different products, but also having now 30% of its revenue, maybe 200% of its profits from cloud computing. So it's taking advantage of something it's very good at, which is logistics, to extend in all these different product lines. Another example I'll give you is like Walmart spreading geographically. Again, kind of a logistics story. And then Apple, if you think about Apple's profitability, its profits per product actually hasn't gone up, but it's exploded in size because it added product lines. It added the iPhone and the iPad. So it's taking advantage of some expertise it had to extend into more categories. So that's going to be the essence of our story, is that concentration rose because IT made it easier for people like Apple to take advantage of what they're good at, to spread, to do more stuff, and to manage more, either more geographic markets or just more product lines. And that these were good firms already that had high markups. So the fact that they spread is going to raise average markups and therefore push down labor share. So we're very much embracing the view that in this theory, in this model, that the reason that labor share is down is because average markups in the economy are up. So then the puzzle we were trying to pose in the title, how come rents could be up in the sense of markups are going to be up? We're very much going to have that in the aggregate. How could innovation be down? Because if we think about, I know we can certainly, Philippe Aghion can do stories where he can give any direction you want between markups and innovation. But my more simplistic thing would be, hey, markups are up. That should give firms a greater incentive to do R&D to capture more markets. So how are we going to get innovation and growth down? How are we going to get lackluster growth? We're going to basically say, if you're going to innovate further, you're going to run up against one of these firms. So an example story of that would be Netflix drove out Blockbuster in a year and a half. They weren't a particularly good firm, and they took over this market, and they're hugely profitable. Now, Disney streaming is entering. We already have Amazon Prime. There's going to be a couple more streaming services. They're all running against efficient firms, or really big, efficient firms. So the marginal markups from entering more markups are actually going to be lower. That might be deterring innovation. So in part of it, just to be completely transparent about this, part of our motivation in this whole thing was to say, these big firms are probably efficient. They're probably doing something good, and that's why they got big. That's probably helping the economy. So we wanted that force in there, and that force is very much going to be in there. As these firms spread, they're efficient, so that's good in a way. But we also wanted somehow that there might be something bad about that. So what I'm trying to be transparent about is we're cooking this in. We're cooking in. We wanted a story where short run it was good, but long run, and maybe we had a burst of growth from the mid-90s to the mid-2000s, but in a longer run sense, it might be undermining innovation. So that's the basic idea that I hope you remember and take away. There's a ton of literature leading up to this. In fact, this is not a hot paper, but it's certainly a hot topic. And so we have lots of competition, but also lots of people have come before us. So Lucas has done a bunch of work documenting decline in labor share and trying to explain where it's come from, for example. And Esteban and Cheng Tai-Sheh, if we had seen their paper before we'd written ours, we might have made it geographic, like my Walmart example, because they're documenting that a lot of the concentration has taken the form of firms entering more geographic markets. Okay, but our contribution relative to a ton of continuing growing literature is a model that's trying to do all three of these things at once, which doesn't mean there isn't a role for lots of other stories out there, like automation or international trade pushing down labor share in manufacturing. But we're trying to have a story that might contribute to, in a non-trivial way, to these three broad trends. Okay, so I'll go over, again, very quickly about the facts in the interest of time, spend more time on the theoretical framework, and then show an illustrative quantification. Okay, so this is the growth one. This is the not controversial part is that we have had slow growth over the last dozen years or so, about 1% TFP growth. We had this 10-year heyday where we grew at almost 3% per year, and MBAs were leaving in droves from Stanford Business School. Like half of them didn't come back for their second year because they went to work for startups during this big boom. And then I guess more controversial is, what did it look like earlier than that? How do you break out the earlier period? So I guess what I'd like to say is this is a slow growth period relative to the whole post-war average, and this was a fast growth period relative to the whole post-war average. And so we're going to have a model that's going to have those features.
So MFP is multi-factor productivity?
Yeah, MFP, TFP, same, right. Yeah. Okay, so this is, we might say, why do we tell an IT story? And we're not going to, we might go farther eventually in trying to use data on the relative price of IT to quantify the magnitude of the shock that might have hit. But this is partly the suggestive story, and this is work by John Fernald, saying, you can't see it that well, actually, even there's almost too many colors in this, but if you look at this 10-year period, or a little bit beyond that 10-year period where growth was fast, the speed up was concentrated at first in IT production, and later in IT consuming, and the low IT intensity group had smaller trends in it, so both the acceleration of growth and the drop down were tightly associated, it seems like, with broad IT producing or IT using. If you break down the decline in labor share, it's concentrated in the high IT, above median IT intensity of use, or in IT producing for that matter. You see a modest decline in IT, or in labor share in the low IT intensity. Okay, so this is a fact from Otter. This is one of the facts we're taking at face value. The top row, and this is from census data, payroll over sales is their measure of labor share. And if you look at the top row, it declines mostly in manufacturing and not so much outside manufacturing. The kind of more striking pattern, which we're going to really key off of and construct our theory to reconcile, is that within firms, labor share actually looks like it went up except for manufacturing. And then, so what's carrying either no clear trend or down in manufacturing, there's a big role for reallocation of market shares towards low labor share firms. So that would be like some big profitable firms with big markups gaining market share, spreading into more markets would be a mechanism. You can see we're going to construct that to try to fit a fact like this. But that does mean that all the theories that said what's happening is, say, less competition in a given market where markups would go up, a lot of those stories are within firm. And we're saying there's not that much evidence for within firm labor share going down, which would be consistent with the within firm markups going up. Okay, so we're very much motivated by these auteur facts to focus on a compositional story. Okay, concentration up, everybody kind of documents that. This is one side fact we need to do more of, and we're doing more of in the census ourselves, which is basically documenting something that Shea and Rossi Hansberg are doing too, which is that there's this big increase in the number of establishments for the right tail of the distribution. So what we need to do is show, where is it happening? We know some of it's retail, but is it more generally in IT-intensive industries and not so much in non-IT-intensive industries, which would be circumstantial evidence that IT might be playing some role in this increase in geographic span.
But that should be using breakout, even public data.
Yeah. Okay. The public data doesn't break it down as nice as even this. We had to clean somewhat based on LBD data that we have, but yeah, we have some LBD stuff, but we can't get it out for a few months. But yeah, from the public stuff is not as much as you would like, I think. Okay, so let's see. So what's our model? So our model doesn't do anything interesting on the consumption side, a representative agent with the usual Euler equation. So all the actions on the production side. So for today, I'm just going to show you the Cobb-Douglas version, and all the action is in these little queues. So picture is Cobb-Douglas aggregation over a fixed variety of products. So it's not going to be Romerian variety growth. It's going to be the quality ladder growth. And then, we're going to have creative destruction be the source of the queues. So on the firm size, again, we have to have heterogeneous firms, a fixed number of firms. So fixed number of products, fixed number of firms, nothing about entry and exit. And these two sources of firm heterogeneity. One is going to be this permanent source of firm heterogeneity, and we're going to call that process efficiency. The only reason we call it process efficiency, so why is it process efficiency, why is it permanent? We call it process efficiency because it makes sense that might be harder to imitate. And then the reason it might be permanent is just that we observe these very persistent differences in revenue over input ratios, which would be consistent with very persistent differences in markups. And it would make sense that might come from some firm-specific attribute. So a key thing, though, is that when firms are adding markets, they're transferring their process efficiency to this extra market that they added. So it's like a firm attribute, how good they are at making stuff. And then there's this separate thing which is growing, which is quality, where firms are innovating, and that's the source of long-run growth. You can get some transitional growth by reallocating production or products to the high process efficiency firms, but that's going to only be a level effect. But that might have contributed to that 10-year burst of growth we got. And then the long-run sources of growth are going to be this. Okay, so, yeah.
So for each I, there are J firms, or there are J firms in total, and each of them has one of these I things?
J firms in total.
J in total, and then they're going to be located across the 0, 1. They're going to split these among themselves.
Yep, and we're going to have like two types of firms, some fraction with high productivity and some fraction with low productivity. And
Q's in your earlier one?
No, this is process efficiency. This verify is just like
Where are the Q's in
that's going to come in the next slide. This is going to be how do you translate labor into quantities, units of output. And so this is going to be permanent differences across these two types of firms. You can see it's a very stylized model deliberately.
Just TFP. Why can't we just call it TFP?
I mean, we want we want a source of growth, and we're going to either have.
Give it the label process.
I mean, process efficiency. I would repeat what I would say a moment ago. It's hard to imitate, harder to imitate than maybe looking at the product attributes and then imitating those. You can see what they are, whereas you can't see the magic of what exactly it is that Walmart's doing with its inventory control. Yeah. Okay, so here's the product quality part, the vertical quality ladder that's generating the growth, and firms are investing in that. So firms are taking some units of output and investing in that. And we're making it all through creative destruction. So that's why it's pretty important, because then if you innovate in a new product market and that product market's already taken by an efficient firm, whether you're efficient or not, you have a tough competitor now. That's going to be the essence of why a spread of efficient firms is actually going to eventually hinder growth, because they're clogging up the markets that therefore mean any future competitor says, oh, whoa, I have to compete against them when they're high process efficiency. And this is going to next feed into, I'm doing exactly what Richard Rogerson tried to help me with my lack of training when I was in graduate school. And one of the things when he read my job market paper was, he's like, don't start talking about results until you're done specifying the environment. So you can see I haven't totally learned that lesson here. I'm already talking about features of the results. So anyway, so we're going to assume that the process efficiency difference we'll call capital delta, the ratio of the high to low. And then the quality ladder steps we'll call gamma. And we're going to assume gamma, just let me just throw a number out. Say gamma is 40% and delta is 35%. So the biggest markup firms is when the best firm, in terms of quality, is a process efficient firm, and they're competing against the next best quality as a not very efficient firm. That'd be like Walmart entering and competing with a mom and pop store. They're like, oh great, we get to charge a huge markup. We may have better quality products, plus we've got high process efficiency. And the medium markup is when it's high against high or low against low. And the lowest markup is when you're a better quality product, but you're competing against somebody with really high process efficiency. So the economy has this heterogeneity of markups based on whether the lead firm looks like relative to the next best firm in every product category, every product. Okay, so then the key thing here is, why don't the efficient firms just take over the whole economy? And so we have to have something diminishing that. And so we have this convex overhead cost to managing a stock of products. So every period you have this flow cost that's convex in the number of products in your portfolio. And that leads to this ability to solve for what the equilibrium would be, which is there's going to be more, again, I'm anticipating results here. There's going to be, this is like a first order condition for how much research you're going to do. And the left-hand side is the marginal cost of doing research, which is the same for the efficient firms and the less efficient firms. But the right-hand side looks different because that's the expected present discounted value of profits. Because if you're efficient, on the one hand, you have high markups. On the other hand, if you have more products in your portfolio, you'll have high overhead costs at the margin. And in equilibrium, since they face the same cost of doing R&D, these things will have to be equated. And that'll generate an equilibrium where, like I said, the number of products for the high-type firms, N star sub H in steady state, will be higher than NL in steady state. Okay, so then we're going to hit this economy with a shot. We're going to do the steady state, and then we're going to characterize. I'll show you some numbers in a bit. But we're going to drop this convex curve. We're going to shift it down. So this convex overcost curve, we're going to basically shift it down. And so it's easier to manage a portfolio of products.
What's the empirical analog of phi 0?
That's what I was saying. If you want, you could look at the relative price of IT and say that's like rapid technological change in IT. That accelerated over that very period where growth accelerated.
I mean, like specifically what?
Oh, I mean, like what kind of things? So we're gonna say this is like intangibles will be one. This stuff will go, like spending on R&D and spending on overhead will both show up in intangibles. So that's going to be one of our targets that will fit, that both the level, and then we'll compare the change in intangibles in the data. But
the other alternative would be specifically Lucas panel control. And then maybe you could say something about compensation of senior management and use that perhaps to discipline changes inside.
Which is very different than R&D.
Yeah. Well, R&D is the part that's going to generate the quality ladder growth. But the overhead,
Phi 0, would you go?
overhead is going to go into intangibles, and R&D is going to go into intangibles.
I assume what you actually stuck in there.
Yeah.
And how?
Yep. Okay, but at the qualitative level, we're going to say if you lowered those overhead costs, what would that do? It would raise the share of products as star that are controlled by the high efficiency firms. So concentration would go up. Labor share would go down because now there'd be more products controlled by the efficient firms, and they tend to have higher markups. and then we're going to ask what happens to the growth rate in the, I guess I'm already stating results here. Yeah, so the share at the efficient firms rises. The gap between the number of products managed by the high efficiency firms and the low efficiency firms widens. So they start controlling a higher share of products and having more products each. So average firm size at the top goes up and concentration goes up. Average markup is, the labor share in the economy is the cost share, inverse of the cost share weighted individual markups. Virgilia will appreciate the cost share weights there. So that just comes definitionally. And this is the revenue share weights of the inverse markup, which in this Cobb-Douglas case, the revenue shares are the same for all the products. So basically what's happening is the aggregate labor share goes down because the market share shifts toward these high efficiency firms, which have higher markups on average. Okay, so what happens to labor share? Yeah, they're more likely to, but the key though is within a particular product though, the producer, if you take over a new product, you're going to more likely, as I was stated before, you're more likely to run into an efficient firm. So that's going to mean that even though average markups in the economy go up, if you innovate and try to take over a new market, at that point you're going to run into an efficient firm and face a low market. Okay, but anyway, the aggregate labor share does go down as long as we start from a position where the efficient firms are big enough. We can get that qualitatively. So the growth rate, the model doesn't say exactly what happens. There's competing effects because there's a direct effect. If you lowered overhead costs, that raises the profitability of doing R&D for both type firms. That just lowers something that affects that's in their value function as a negative. So that stimulates R&D. But then there's this GE effect that I keep emphasizing, that within product lines, once the S star rises, you could face this expected low markup from further innovation. And that, depending on parameter values, the net effect could be positive or negative. So that's just a quantitative issue. Okay, so now I'm ready to talk about the quantification. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to choose some parameters of the model to fit some 1990 or earlier baseline, something before both the growth acceleration and the more recent slowdown in growth. And then one of the key things, and I guess that's what Ellen's pressing on, is how do you discipline this drop in overhead costs?
You lied to me.
I lied to you?
You said some words and now it's different.
Okay. So let me tell you what we do, and you can cross-examine me later about whether that was consistent with what I said earlier. So we're going to say, okay, so one thing we could have done that we might do instead is we could say, here's the decline in the relative price of IT over this period. That decline's about 50%, and so we can say this is the decline in, implicitly saying that all of this overhead cost is IT intensive, is IT. So that would be about a 50% decline. Instead, we chose, partly we were enamored about that for a while that, it's all these competitor papers are coming out. What really seemed to distinguish us is not only trying to have a theory with the one shock that might be contributing to all these three broad forces, but a lot of the other forces weren't going this between component, that the change in labor share was really a between phenomenon, not a within firm phenomenon. So here we chose to calibrate the decline in the overhead cost to match the between decline in labor share in the aggregate in our simple economy. So we're choosing parameters to fit some pre-growth acceleration, growth slowdown, and then choosing a single shock to the overhead cost to fit one aspect of the change from, say, the early 90s to the most recent data. And then we're going to ask, what's the resulting change in the growth rate, concentration, and aggregate labor share? And I showed you the Cobb-Douglas case with log utility, but obviously it's more realistic to think about CRA preferences and to think about CES aggregation. So when I actually show you a quantification, it'll be that generalized case. Okay, so the specter of Ellen is with me, but she's actually here too. So I knew you were going to say, like, what numbers should we focus on? All of them. But anyway, okay, so these are things we tried to fit beforehand. So we basically have 6 parameters we're choosing to fit 6 targets. Paco will appreciate that from an earlier discussion. So the only thing I haven't told you, well, I guess, okay, so we're going to fit initial concentration. We're going to fit an initial growth rate. we don't fit initial concentration that well. I'm not too stressed about that because what is concentration? I mean, you can tell I'm already trying to be slippery about one testable implication of the model, but like what is a market and how do you measure concentration? I hope people don't have answers for that very clearly. So, but anyway, we're understating concentration of the top 10% of firms within 4-digit industries in the census data, according to Otter et al. But so we match productivity growth of 1.8%. We match some aggregate markup. That's probably a little too high for your taste, Virgilio, but too low for some other people's taste, but that's what we fit. We're fitting some Farhigurial real interest rate, and we fit some intangible share, tried to fit it as a target. So that's some
This is the BEA.
Corrado. No, we took Corrado et al. Because it was broader and had, it was broader basically. Yeah. We could take the BEA, that would be smaller. It would be a smaller share than this. We looked at that one too.
I don't know what is in your denominator because I don't know if you're trying to cover the whole economy.
We're trying to cover non-farm business, which is where productivity data comes from, and all the Otter et al. Facts, which is what we're heavily relying on, are 80% of GDP and basically all of the non-farm business part. So we feel like we've got comparability in terms of the productivity we're doing, where the markup stuff, I don't know. But we tried to get sectors that covered the share we're looking at, and the intangibles as well. So I think we've got broad consistency. So the one fact that's kind of interesting that I didn't mention is you'd like the model to kind of fit. One key thing is that bigger firms have bigger markups. So one thing that Otter et al. Emphasized is that's true in the data. If you think about the production elasticity is the same for all firms, which is what Virgilio was mentioning. It's a strong assumption, but if you assume that, then say the variation in labor share is due to, well, this is an empirical moment that we fit through markup variation between size. But the empirical moment is for every doubling in the cross-section within an industry, for every doubling of sales, the labor share on average goes down about 1 percentage point. So that's what one fact that Otter et al. Documented. And so we're going to fit that in our model through the inverse relationship between size and labor share coming from markups going up with size.
That's why you don't target the average labor share instead of the markup?
The reason we don't target that is because the model only has labor. So labor share in the data, so the markup isn't literally the inverse labor share in the real world like it is in the markup in the data. So the inverse labor share, inverse markup here is closer to like what would be like labor plus capital share, right? We wouldn't want to make the markup so big that it's 1 over the 0.6 labor share or 0.63 labor share. See what I mean? So we have a smaller markup, which implies labor is really standing in for labor and capital combined. So another way to say it is that our prediction that labor share is down is also a prediction that capital share, measured not as a residual but as in a Barkai way or Farhigurio way, should go down as well because markups were up. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so that's what we fit by construction. The other thing we tried to fit by construction. The other thing we tried to fit by construction was hit this thing with one shock, which is this decline in this overhead cost. So that's the psi sub O. It's a big decline. It's cut by 65%. The relative price of IT over that 10-year period is cut by 50%. So we might end up shifting this to 50%. That's still kind of heroic. Why is overhead cost, the cost of overhead necessarily so tightly linked to IT? But we should think about shifting to that.
What cost category would have fallen that much in accounting?
Oh, that's the thing. We're not going to see intangible shares going to go up. Because the big firms are going to endogenously expand so much that intangible investment will actually go up. So you wouldn't see intangible investment go down. And we don't predict it does. Okay, so what else was I going to say about that? That it seems like a big decline, but I know another thing. Another thing that's stylized about this is that when I show you a simulation, it's going to happen all at once. We're going to do it like a big bang, where the decline in the relative price wasn't like a huge 50% decline in 1 year. It was like accumulated over 10 years. So we have more work to think about on that. I'll talk about transition in a minute, but yeah.
If the labor share is 65% and profits are
In the data or in the?
in the data,
Okay.
and profits are 30% or something, the level of profit.
Here?
Yeah, 25-30%.
No, because we've got the spending on R&D and spending on intangibles.
You have fixed costs.
we got spending out of output on R&D and intangibles and stuff like that. So pure profits are not going to equal the inverse of the markups minus 1 over, yeah. Yeah, I'll show you what rents are, I think, in the next slide. Okay, so this is all looking good in the sense that we get like of a 1 percentage point, well, the growth rate declines from 1.8 to 1.06. We actually overshoot that, but we get a big decline in the growth rate. So what was ambiguous in the model, we did this simple calibration, we actually got a big decline in the growth rate, maybe too much. We fit the between change in labor share. We actually understate how much labor share went down in the aggregate, and that's because we overstate the within increase in labor share. Anyway, that might be okay that we're not fitting the full decline in labor share in the sense that, Daron is already mad at us. No, it's got to be robots. You got to put robots at the center of this. So we're like, there's room for robots here. So this is the embarrassment, though. It's a very stylized model, 2 types of firms. To get this kind of, we're trying to fit these big things like between changes in labor share. So that calibration required us to have a big change in concentration. So instead of being a 5 percentage point increase in the market share of the top 10% of firms, we needed a 35 percentage point. So that's the big glaring, issue there. But intangibles, we thought it was kind of cool that it went up. This is per Ellen, let me tell you what to focus on here. So R&D goes down. So that's a bit of an embarrassment because in the data, R&D doesn't go down. So let me take this opportunity to say, if any of you have known me enough, you'll know this is completely consistent over time. I've never used R&D data and said, oh, this is R&D. And here we're saying this is just a model prediction of research investments. So R&D is like 90% in manufacturing plus health. So it's like Walmart doesn't do R&D and all these other firms aren't doing it. There's a little bit in software now that didn't used to be in software. So I think measured R&D is not what we have in mind in this model. So it could be innovation investments fell. So I'm not actually trying to fit into that. And we're having overhead costs soar. Even though the cost of overhead fell, the endogenous increase in concentration is causing overhead investments to soar. So if you put those together, that's what caused intangibles to go up. So that part we are fitting and saying maybe all these R&D type investments are showing up in intangibles, even if they don't show up literally in R&D. So rents aren't trivial. This gets back to Lucas's thing. Rents aren't trivial, but they're not the full markup here. But they go up a little bit. So rents are up, and yet growth rate's down significantly. Here we get kind of a freebie, I think Virgilio like this, that the real interest rate goes down because we got the growth rate went down. So, obviously one reason for the real interest rate being low could be the growth rate's been low. Okay, so a little bit on the transition. So maybe partly due to my training, but my co-authors are better. We've only characterized the Cobb-Douglas case so far for the transition dynamics, but we're very interested in doing the CES, and I'll say a little bit about how they might differ in a second. So this is all we have so far to show you is, and one of the reasons we're really interested in transition is because we don't even know the welfare effect, even if the growth rate's down in the long run. Because in the short run, you get this burst of productivity, so maybe the burst in productivity is worth the long run growth decline. So this is saying within like 10 years, concentration soars. Creative destruction actually soars at first because, again, firms are like, great, I can start entering these new markets. It's easier for me to manage a portfolio of products. So as the big firms, efficient firms expand, they're doing more creative destruction, and then it comes down, all happening within a 10-year period. These are years.
No, but what was your initial period?
It's 10 years. We hit the shock on impact. That's kind of unrealistic that we did. It's all like pre-1990, like 1990 and earlier. We were fitting like concentration and the real interest rate all before the speed up in growth and the drop. So we're picturing this shock hitting mid-90s, and it happens within 10 years. So we kind of like the fact that it didn't take 50 years or 1 year, because we hit it with a big bang shock. So if you slow it down, it might slow it down kind of nicely here. But this is just the Cobb-Douglas case. Like with with more curvature and utility, the real interest rate's going to move around more in the transition. That's going to slow things down. So this is the log utility in Cobb-Douglas production case. This is kind of boring. Well, no, this is kind of important, this previous one. So process efficiency in the aggregate goes up like 4 percentage points. So we get like a 4 percentage boost from the shift in market share toward these efficient firms. This is like this big positive. On top of this spike in innovation here. So we get a spike in innovation and like a level effect too from this. I'll skip over this. So let me just focus on, I know I'm running out of time, so the one on the far left, which is showing that output in the blue because of the drop in overhead costs, it starts out going higher. That's the process efficiency kick and the innovation kick. But eventually, the spread of these firms undermines innovation, and eventually you fall below the original path without the shock altogether. So the very last thing I'll just tell you is we do what's the present discounted value, and it's negative. So it looks like it's bad, that despite the fact that you get this burst in productivity, and for 20 years you're higher consumption and output, it's actually negative. But I want to have a cautionary point there, which is that if we allowed more substitutability across firms, it's conceivable we'll get something different for that. But this is what we're getting for now. I will stop now and turn it over to Sam. Thanks very much.
OK, so Pete predictably did a great job on laying out the data. I'm not going to focus a lot on that. But let's just remember the puzzle here is really to have a theory that connects with one shock, three changes that occurred. Number one being the decline in productivity growth after that burst from kind of centered around the year 2000. The second is the increase in firm concentration. And the third is the decline in the labor share. And I think a really nice thing is his emphasis on that the decline in the labor share. It's much more evidence of it as a between rather than a within effect. And the way they're going to go after it is consistent with that. What's their story? I do think this fits into what Lars was talking about of kind of quantitative story. And in fact, I noticed that Pete used the word story as well. So let me, maybe this is Richard's slide where you kind of try and prove that you read the paper. OK, the firms innovate to improve the quality of goods. And what they're creating, and I'm speaking to Ed here, and I guess Ellen as well, they're creating these intangible, non-rival originals. So that's the idea. They're innovating. They're creating, ideas, blueprints for new products that are higher quality. OK. There's some return on these intangibles that's then going to cut into labor share. So that's the connection there. OK. Now, there are two types of firms. There's just fixed numbers of them. So there are high-type firms and low-type firms. And that was the thing about the high-type have low process costs, high process efficiency. Low-type have low process efficiency. Those are just non-changing attributes of a fixed, unchanging number of firms. OK, now, the fact that these high-type firms have this lower production cost gives them an incentive to build up a larger stock of intangibles because it sort of has a bigger payoff to them because they're efficient producers, so that you kind of want to have them doing more, or they want to be doing more of the innovation. And that then, by the statement above of cutting into labor share, that kind of drives down their labor share. Or leaves their labor share lower. OK, now we have the shock. There's the IT revolution. That eases the cost of running a big operation. So running Amazon wouldn't be possible without the IT revolution. That plays into the hands. So this is a big firm, not a high-type firm necessarily. But we already saw that the high-type firms become the big firms. So this neutral shock plays into the hands of the high-type firms and lets them expand. And then by them expanding, and they were the low labor share firms, the labor share, the aggregate labor share goes down. And then you get productivity jumping. Maybe that could be that decade of rapid productivity growth just by the fact that the economy is shifting to these process-efficient firms. But then the steady state innovation rate actually goes down. It's not easy to tell that story, and I'm not sure that part is so robust, and I'll come back to it when we get to the theory. But that's kind of the story of this paper. OK, now here's quality ladders, and I put it in Minnesota to just remind me now as I get to chat about a little history. But this is the quality ladders model of Grossman and Helpman. So 0 to 1 is a unit continuum. These are a whole bunch, a unit continuum of different goods that are available in the economy. We have Cobb-Douglas preferences for them. We can normalize spending to be 1, so you spend the same amount on each good. That's this kind of beautiful model that Grossman and Helpman wrote down, one of the 3 big breakthroughs of the new growth theory. So what's happening there? Well, it's quality ladders. So the idea of these little boxes are the innovations. These are the things of height gamma that stack on top of each other and give us quality improvements. So this good here, which should be infinitesimally skinny because we're talking about a unit continuum, there are 3 innovations there. This one has 2, and you have to use your imagination for all the other goods out there. And then the red one's a new innovation. It's going to land somewhere. And when it lands somewhere, that's going to be a firm that took over producing that good. And it's going to be producing that good and getting revenue of 1 and getting some profits because it will be able to have a markup over the predecessor. And it'll be able to have a markup equal to the its improvement over who came before, which is gamma greater than 1. And that all happened in Grossman and Helpman's model with individual firms always being entrants and knocking out some incumbent. And then you got entering firms doing R&D. The blocks keep stacking up. Productivity goes up. Quality of goods goes up. So we have kind of constant spending, but quality adjusted price is falling, and that was the growth model. So I was back in Boston and talking to a guy named Tori Jakob Klenow. We were both in the MBR group hearing all these things about patents and productivity and so on at the firm level, R&D spending and so on. And we always kind of thought there's got to be a model that kind of makes sense of this. All these people are running these regressions and we don't quite know what to make of them or how they're related to this new growth theory. So we like this place as a starting point, and so we thought, why don't we reformulate it and think about firms as not these entrants, but as sort of owning innovations at different points along here, which they get by doing R&D and dropping down these red blocks, and therefore gaining new goods. And so firms spread out and gain new goods, and then other firms come along and maybe knock out one of their goods. And if enough other firms come out and knock their goods out, they might disappear, they'd lose all their goods, or they could become very large. So it gave you a model of heterogeneity and R&D spending and productivity and so on. So anyway, right around that time, I was about to be kicked out of BU, and I think it must have been Tom called me in 2000, so this is my Chari type story, and said, why don't you come out for a job talk? And it was a cold fall day, really cold. It wasn't that late in the fall, as I remember. I was trying to put it together, remembering all these things about years. I think it was the fall of 2000 by reverse engineering, because I know I showed up here in 2001. But I'm giving it away because this is the paper I presented. And somehow I got the offer anyway. I don't think it went over too well, but that's what I presented. Now, in this paper, the paper of Pete's, they kind of reversed something in a clever way, because they also took Grossman and Helpman and kind of spun it differently, but they did it just the opposite of us. So we had a continuum of firms, each with a countable number of products. They have fixed integer number of firms, each with the continuum of products. So they kind of lose the whole thing about firm dynamics, except in a transition, but they get some other, as we saw, they get a kind of nice story. But you do have to remember that these firms in a steady state in their model are kind of unchanging objects because they have a continuum of, each has a continuum of goods. Okay. So here's their model in a nutshell, and it's a lot easier to explain in a steady state, so I'm kind of mixing steady state and non-steady state in the following sense. S star represents the set of, see, when we think about the model, how do you go backwards? Here. Just remember in your mind that this unit continuum of goods, that still has meaning in their model. And the fraction of those that are controlled by the high-type firms is S star, or S, and then S star means in the steady state. So I'm going to hold that S star fixed while I think about, while I describe how the model works. That's kind of a cheat because we have to, in the end, make sure that's the S star we get. Okay. But anyway, for a given S star, you can figure out what the labor share is because the labor share is related to, remember how the innovations sort of generate profit that lowers the labor share. So you either made an innovation on another high-type firm and then you had a markup of gamma, or you hit it big and innovated on a low-type firm with probability 1 minus S star, or I should say it's a fraction 1 minus S star of those continuum of goods you have, where you've innovated over a low-type firm and have a markup of gamma lambda, where lambda or delta is the amount by which you're more efficient in process than the low-type firm. Okay, so that gives you a labor share of a high-type firm. Then this is very familiar from Grossman and Hellman. Your profits are just 1 minus the labor share, but then kind of like my paper with Klenow, there you have n of them, so you multiply it by n because you have n here, a continuum n of products. And then the new thing they've added, they have innovation being a linear technology, so the thing that stops you from taking over everything is this term where that's kind of your span of control cost, which is quadratic in the measure of goods that you have. Okay, so then you get a Bellman equation, which I think is a nice way to think about the model. A firm, a high-type firm, has a measure n of products. It's thinking about what it should try and get next period, n prime. It's thinking about its profit flow. It's thinking about the cost of innovating phi c times how many it's going to get. And if it wants to grow, it's got to make up for the ones that get knocked out by other firms. And that occurs with probability z star. So z1 minus z star is the probability that its old products won't get knocked out. So this is how many products remain of those it had before. And then, and then it has, now it's become a firm with n prime products. And then to finish it up, you then take the solution to this, which in steady state would be nh star, the n choice of an h-type firm, and that's just constant in steady state, multiply it by the fixed number of high-type firms, and you get the S star, which is what I used up there. So you want to have a solution to that thing. Now here's a way to think about the solution. One of the things that's easy to, I think I praised the paper. I'm not praising the way it does this part because it's a little bit sloppy and it's hard to, there are many things to worry about here and they haven't worried about very many of them. And so you kind of think about the model and think, oh, why don't I do this case? And then you realize, oh, that case would make you go out of bounds or something like that. So there's a lot of tidying up to be done in that respect. But this line here is kind of familiar from trade theory, like if you were doing the the Lerner diagram, I'm sorry, but you have 1 over, you have to be on this line because there's only a measure 1 of goods. And so JL times the number of, the measure of goods of a low-type firm plus JH times the measure of firms with the measure of goods of a high-type firm has to be 1. So you got to be on this line. Now there's this other line that you get out of the Bellman equation, which gives you a relationship between NH and NL, and you want the intersection, and then you go down, and that gives you the number of measured products of a low-type firm and measured products of a high-type firm. Okay, and then what happens? Well, now we put the shock in, which is that the cost of span of control goes down. So that swings that curve down, and you can show this analytically. It swings that curve down. It lowers the intercept, so for sure you're going to be over to the right here, and that is the new after the shock steady state value of the measure of products. And so what we're seeing is that the measure of products of the high-type firms goes up, but then it has to go down for the low-type firms. And that's just because the high-type firms took over a bunch of those that the low-type firms used to have. So that's very natural. But you can already see one of the things you have to watch out for that I was running into in desperation yesterday is, how do you know you don't intersect out there? What would that mean? So that's a kind of corner solution. So you got to, anyway, the model's a little subtle that way. I mean, that's actually kind of a good thing. It's just that the way the paper's currently written kind of runs bulldozer over those issues. Okay, so now to get to growth, you have, well, maybe let's jump to here. The growth rate is going to depend on Z star, the probability of innovation happening in any given good, and you just multiply it by the log of the step size, and that's just like Grossman and Helpman. You're back to Grossman and Helpman again. And then how do you figure out Z star? Well, from that equation. But that's the one that's subtle, because it can go either way. It didn't necessarily have to go up, or it didn't have to go down necessarily when the span of control went down. That comes out from the numbers they use, but it didn't have to be that way. Sorry, I think I only have one more slide. So let me jump to it. Agenda. I think there's a nice agenda here. This, in a sense, this paper is employing a new growth model to tell a quantitative story in Lars's sense, I think. And I think those quantitative stories aren't quite as laughable as they used to be. So it's a story that features non-rival intangibles, links to the firm level data, and it's GE. I mean, all the endogenous growth models were GE, so that's nice. And I think the literature is kind of evolving from toy models to semi-serious, and I think it's a good trajectory. And I think these are models that aren't really in the Minnesota tradition, but they share a lot with it, actually. And I think as they get better, people may start to appreciate them more. I mean, I'm mentioning these papers. I should have had Erzo on here as well. I'll just say he was too old to go on there, just like myself. And I want to just remember Tor Jakob Klenow, who would have really appreciated this direction of the work we were trying to do, because this is sort of what his vision has been for that work.